Apartheid, which means apartness in Afrikaans, was a system of entrenched racial segregation. It was the law of the land in South Africa from 1948 to 1994. The roots of apartheid can be found in Dutch and British colonialism. The Dutch East India Company established the first European settlement in southern Africa in 1652 at Table Bay, now Cape Town. The majority of these early settlers were farmers. They seized land from indigenous Africans and established a system of slavery so they could grow crops and raise livestock on a bigger scale. These early Dutch-speaking settlers developed a distinct language known as Afrikaans and were often referred to as Afrikaners or Boers, which means farmers.
Britain first took control of the region in 1795, later establishing the Cape of Good Hope colony. With the imposition of British rule and laws, around 13,000 Afrikaners left the settlement in the 1830s, embarking on what would become known as the Great Trek. This resulted in the establishment of the independent Boer republics of the Transvaal, and the Orange Free State in the interior of South Africa, far away from the Cape Colony. While the Dutch and British were colonial rivals, the laws and customs they enacted were all based around the exploitation of the indigenous African population. This effectively laid the groundwork for apartheid in the mid-20th century. The system of apartheid began in May 1948, when the National Party, NP, came to power in a narrow election victory. The NP represented the interests of the white Afrikaans-speaking population.
Responding to the racist fears of this white minority over increased levels of black migration to South African cities, the new government wasted little time imposing laws that further regulated the lives and movement of the African, colored, a term used to refer to people who had mixed race and Indian populations. While segregation was already the norm in South Africa, apartheid rigidly enshrined this as government policy and led to the increased persecution of the country's non-white majority. Pictured here is a whites-only park bench during the early years of apartheid. The image has been supplied courtesy of the Anti-Apartheid Movement archives.
Laws such as Group Areas Act, 1950 gave classified specific areas according to race. While the 1952 Natives Act made it mandatory for all non-whites to carry passes and determined what areas they could live and work in. White control over the African population was further extended by legislation such as the Bantu Authorities, 1951, and the Natives Resettlement, 1954 Acts, which were aimed at the retribalization of the African population in rural areas and provided the legislative framework for the state to remove Africans from urban spaces and to further redistribute land to white people.
The NP also worked to control social interactions between different racial groups, passing the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act, 1949, and then the Immorality Amendment Act, 1950, which made extramarital sex between white people and people of other races illegal. Under apartheid, 87% of South Africa was reserved for whites. Rural Africans were confined to the overcrowded Bantustans and urban Africans were treated as migrant workers. All of these laws were designed to maintain white power in South Africa. It affected almost every aspect of an individual's life, determining where they could live and work, their access to education, who they could socialize with, and what they could buy. Later, many Africans were confined to barren and overcrowded homelands in rural areas. Under apartheid, 87% of South Africa was reserved for whites. Rural Africans were confined to the overcrowded Bantustans and urban Africans were treated as migrant workers. All of these laws were designed to maintain white power in South Africa. It affected almost every aspect of an individual's life, determining where they could live and work, their access to education, who they could socialize with, and what they could buy. Later, many Africans were confined to barren and overcrowded homelands in rural areas. Under apartheid, 87% of South Africa was reserved for whites. Rural Africans were confined to Bantustans and urban Africans were treated as migrant workers. Indeed, by the mid-1950s, 250,000 Africans were being sent to jail annually for violating past laws. The following words from Dora Tamona, an African anti-apartheid activist gives a clear sense of just how intrusive and brutal apartheid was on a personal level.
Under the system, an African cannot buy land or live outside locations and reserves which are set aside for him. We make up 2/3 of the population, but only 1/10 of the country is set aside for us. Because we have no land for our crops and our cattle, we must live and work on the white man's farms, on the mines, factories and towns. Only in this way can we pay the taxes and school fees, buy food and clothing, and pay our doctor's bills. Yet, we are not allowed to travel to look for work without a permit. Our country is truly a prison house. Dora Tomana, a speech to the Women's International Democratic Federation Conference, 1955. It is important to note that apartheid was challenged throughout the entirety of its existence. The 1950s saw mass civil disobedience campaigns and protests all over the country, with women playing a particularly important role in challenging the implementation of new racist laws. In 1955, the African National Congress, ANC, South African Indian Congress, SIC, South African Communists, and a number of other groups formed the Congress Alliance Against Apartheid.
These organizations collectively issued the Freedom Charter in 1955, which set out a vision for non-racial democracy in the country. After the Sharpeville massacre on March 21, 1960, which saw the murder of 69 protesters when police opened fire on thousands of anti-pass protesters, the political situation in South Africa looked particularly bleak. The National Party declared a state of emergency after the massacre, arresting more than 2,000 people. They also moved quickly to ban both the ANC and Pan-Africanist Congress, PAC, forcing many anti-apartheid activists underground and into exile overseas. Convinced that peaceful protest would not lead to change in South Africa, both the ANC and PAC formed armed wings and engaged in acts of sabotage and guerrilla warfare against the apartheid state. While state repression made resistance within South Africa difficult, activists continued to find ways to challenge apartheid, both domestically and internationally. The 1970s saw renewed waves of resistance in the country, with the Black Consciousness Movement and the Soweto Uprising symbolizing the militancy of a new generation of African activists. At the same time, exiled South Africans and a politically diverse range of groups continued to work on boycott, sanctions, and divestment campaigns designed to isolate the apartheid state. With the apartheid economy in difficulty, and amid an explosion of mass protest throughout the country embodied by the coordinated campaigns of the United Democratic Front, apartheid was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Facing internal and external pressures, National Party was forced into some reluctant reforms, and in 1990, released Nelson Mandela from Robben Island 27 years after he was first imprisoned. The ANC and other anti-apartheid groups were also unbanned. Apartheid finally came to an end in 1994, with Mandela and the ANC triumphing in the country's first democratic election.